Another week's gone by, and we're gathered again, a bunch of friends, having a tipple, trying to solve the world's problems. You shouldn't take us too seriously, and if you do, perhaps you should too have a tipple, and if that doesn't suffice, perhaps you ought to consult a neurologist.
Or have tea.
Well, I wouldn't recommend that.
It's very soothing. It's got medicinal.
He's left the patient in charge of the asylum. I'm hosting today, and we have a friend of ours, Dr. Mkodzongwi, who is a scholar and an expert in agriculture, and we are going to have a rabbit hole episode where we discuss land reform. So perhaps to start us off, Tinashe can just give us maybe some context in terms of where we're coming from, in terms of the land issue and where we are today.
Okay, I think at the material time, or what's necessary for this discussion, is that pre-2000 or 2001, we had a land tenure system, which was privately held tenure. I think two systems. You had a privately held commercial enterprise, and land was in private hands. You had title deeds, and then you had the communal properties, which was under the Communal Act. Doc can give us the finer details. But what happened post-2000 is the constitution was changed, and there was compulsory land acquisition that happened, and it concerned 11 million hectares, I think, and those were distributed to, depending on who you believe, you have individuals. I think it's above 200,000, from 200,000 right through to 400,000 families who were distributed, and according to A1 and A2 farmers. So now land is now held by the state, and we do not have anything above 40 hectares. I think that's the... So if it's within the city enviro, then yes, you can have title deeds. But beyond the city, if it's beyond 40 hectares, then it's actually land owned by the state and not in private hands. And the communal land is still in the Communal Act, but the president has, quite scathing or a lot more latitude in what he can and cannot do with that particular land. I'm not an
expert, but Doc, did he start at the right place when you gave us a brief history of land tenure in this country? Did we start from a place where land was privately held with title deeds? Mm-hmm. Or maybe the history is a bit older than that?
No, the history is a bit older, but for the purposes of this
discussion, yeah,
we could go for a week, if not more. I think he starts at the contentious moment of 2000, of course, when the land tenure system was fundamentally changed in favor of the complete state ownership of land. Just to correct things, there is still people holding freehold tenure. They're a minority. They are people who owns land with freehold.
You have to be black, right?
You have to be freehold tenures. Yeah. You need to be black, but there are also white people holding it. It's quite complex.
BIPA.
Yeah, it's quite complex. Even some people lost land, and the state is in the process of trying to compensate them or give them more land. So we have a good number of, it's not significant, we have a good number of the earlier black capitalist farmers who acquired their land and got freehold tenure. Some of them politically lost those freehold lands to the land reform, although the land reform was really targeted at the white minority landowners who were perceived as the adversaries in the process. But some blacks lost their land and are in the process of being compensated or given.
Would you like to speak to that? Why would a black farmer lose land
they were
that they acquired?
I assume they were not politically compliant.
So explain that. How does being politically compliant?
Look at this. You have to understand that
enter in our lexicon.
At the moment of the land reform was essentially you know, in the interest of not confusing things, there was the first land reform programs, which was the official government policy. But the implementation of the process was rather informal, led by war veterans. And the way it unfolded across provinces, districts, and across Zimbabwe was different. You got a process where war veterans would go into a farm, mobilize local people, and say, we are taking over this farm. In some places, there was resistance. In some places, the white owner would just say, oh, you guys, can you allow me time to ship off? In some places, they were the white farmer who would mobilize his farm workers to resist the land reform. And in some places, there was violence, sometimes fatal. But what we are saying, you've got black farmers who had acquired their land and got freehold title, who ended up losing their land on suspicion of either being supporting the opposition or being anti-land reform. So because at the moment the government was not completely in control of what was happening across the provinces. So this is why you see almost 20 years after, those people have been lobbying to say that I'm a black person, I'm entitled to my land. My land got taken by the state and redistributed to other black people. So I need my land back. And the state has responded by making sure that Pipa farms and those lands that were taken from black people should be returned.
So beyond economics, it's a political issue. Politics entered into...
You can never separate the land issue.
Of course, there's some politics to it, but I think what we want to focus on here is the economic perspective.
Well, I think let's dwell on it's political. That land is political. Can you help us unpack that? And I would love to hear your views on land, which is a factor of production. Would you say labor is political? Would you say capital is political? Would you say profit is political?
Yes, when you look at us who are sort of interested in Marxian political economy, is that issues of property ownership, issues of labor.
Did you say Marxian political economy?
Yes.
There are reasonable people who study this and take it seriously.
Well, not reasonable people. Huge intellectuals.
We have one here.
Sitting here. And unfortunately. So we are saying...
Yeah, but let's hear this argument.
Just back to the fact. You know, the issue of productivity was pretty much over-discussed, particularly when the land occupation started in Zimbabwe. You cannot, in a former settler colony like Zimbabwe, the problem you have across the region, and this is not specific to Zimbabwe, it is a problem of the region because of the histories of settler colonialism, is that you've got people who came here, occupied land and forced natives off the land.
You mean Mzilikazi?
No, not Mzilikazi. Let's not mix up things. Mzilikazi was a mobile guy who moved from South Africa.
So Mzilikazi was mobile, but Cecil was not mobile.
Yeah, that's a discussion for another forum. We can engage in that, but for the purposes of this, there is an argument, which I think is mischievous, by the way, that the white settlers want to say, if Mzilikazi came here, how are we different? They are different because Mzilikazi did not come by ship. He walked across the river.
Oh, come on.
And that material difference makes all the world...
No, because in terms of claiming an autonomous connection to the soils of the region, Mzilikazi will tell you what? We people in the region have been mobile. So their mobility is from South Africa. And remember, you are framing this idea of Mzilika as being a foreigner based on ideas of nations that came with colonial settlers. Remember, in the region, kingdoms, chiefdoms did not have properly clear marked boundaries. People were mobile.
Okay, this is a historical rabbit hole. So I think this is quite interesting, and perhaps we can pursue it further.
But I think he was articulating why land is a political issue, and I wanted to really understand
what we are saying here at the moment of 2000. The history is when we got to 1980, and the government deliberately, after the liberation struggle, deliberately wanted to make sure that they are addressing inequalities in the land ownership structure that was inherited from colonialism. That process was aborted. Very little land was transferred to the blacks, and that created a problem. We are a rural country, and most people who supported the liberation struggle, by the way, wanted to recover land because their livelihoods are based on the land. Now, so when people try to make sense of the land occupation, they just try to project it as unreasonable, it's not economical. No, it's not supposed to be economical. The motive behind land occupations was to recover land, no matter.
So I'll tell you where I differ and why it becomes very difficult, why your argument becomes a very difficult argument is the minute you make land an political issue, it means that its contestation will never end, because by its very nature, politics is a contestation that will never end.
I want to stop you there, Tinashe, because I think that fundamentally everywhere in the world where we have a government, that government has a constituency and it's intrinsically political. So we can have that discussion about the politics of it ad infinitum. What I am interested in, and I think what we are better qualified to discuss, is in the context of Zimbabweans, right? If you want a thriving economy that delivers prosperity, right? What land regime is most likely to deliver that outcome? And what land regime is least likely to deliver that outcome? And my view is that, notwithstanding the sound political arguments you've articulated, the way land reform was done in this country actually made Zimbabweans poor.
But that's an economic argument. Yes, he's making a political argument.
No. And I want to move away from the political argument.
But how can you move away from the political argument when he has correctly or unjustly contextualized land as a political issue? And I'm saying the minute it's political, then it will always be contested.
See, one of the mistakes we must never make, and we should never make, is to separate land from politics. Land is political, actually. This is why, when even people like Cicero acquired the sort of royal charter for the British South Africa Company to
are you going to argue that was political as well?
It is political. It is. What is a royal?
Remember,
charter?
he's a Marxian. So in Marxian, it's
so what we are saying is the political
argument, the contestation is always between classes.
The ZANU-PF government had the burden of delivering land, starting from when they were in Mozambique, mobilizing people on the basis of addressing historical injustices in the land ownership structure. And for 20 years, they failed to deliver the land. They failed on that political promise. As a mobilization tactic, most people who joined the liberation struggle had suffered injustices perpetrated by colonialism. Now, when you have 20 years, when you have got a government made up of people who had promised to return ancestral lands to the people and failed. So there was, as a way of pacifying the socio-economic and political situation, they needed to allow a radical transformation of property. And this is the context to the land reform. Look, the economic argument is secondary to the historical argument. We are saying,
well, there's the historical and then there's a political. Yeah. By the time we get to economic,
when we redistribute the land, when you give people back the land, capacitate them. So we essentially, we are not discarding the economic argument. How do you, after you give people the land, the question now is how do we capacitate all these people?
But it's impossible, and I'll tell you why it's impossible. Because rightly or wrongly, you've actually captured the problem with Zimbabwe, is that you've made land a political issue. So maybe let's move away from land, and I'll give you a good example, a company. So in a feudal state, our corporation is not governed by any rule whatsoever. Our corporation is purely driven on a political ground. So by cooperation, I mean, if we are friends, we can decide, you know what, let's just go and involve ourselves in some activity and or hunting or whatever it is. And after we've hunted, we will just divide whatever we hunt. The proportion in which we divide whatever we get, whatever the spoils are, it's not predetermined. It's even our effort in hunting is actually not predetermined. It's we go out there and we hunt because the three of us are involved. If we do catch something, the spoils will be divided amongst us three. And that's the feudal state where hunting is purely a political game. Political in the sense that the only reason why we've cooperated is because we see ourselves as political beings. Now, it's far different from economics, because in economics, before we even... Wait,
we'll get into...
let me just finish. Let me finish the line.
And we're going to go into the economics of things, which I find much more interesting than the politics in the second segment.
Okay, all right. I'll explain the difference between political and economic, and why Zimbabwe, unless Zimbabwe takes land into the economic sphere, unfortunately, we're stuck in politics.
But again,
okay, gentlemen, we will be back shortly, and this discussion will continue. Welcome back. We're discussing the emotive issue of land tenure, the politics and economics of it. And Tinashe is one of the most argumentative people I know, but when he's in the same room with the doc, he becomes argumentative times 1.5. And we were now getting into the economics of land.
Yes, so I wanted to make the distinction between politics and economics, and you're a doc, so you will understand this, that politics centers around normative statements and normative world.
Big words.
Well, normative is what ought to be. So when he looks at land not what is or not what has, but what it ought to be. And why I said it will continuously be under contestation, because what ought to be, it will, by its very nature, be continuously under contestation. So what ought to be in 2000 and today is fundamentally different. So that's why I said land will always be, as long as it remains a political issue, and as long as it remains around what ought to be, then it will always be under contestation. And I wanted to move it into economics, because in economics, another quite innovative thing that happened over the centuries is the formation of a company, where we actually agree that what ought to be, you ought to be a billionaire, but you're not. You ought to... Exactly. So what ought to be, we move away from what ought to be, we move away from our morality, and we say, okay guys, what do we have? So before we go hunting, perhaps the doctor has more money than we do, so he will say, you know what, I'm not going to be the one hunting, but I'm going to employ Ranga and everyone else to hunt on my behalf, and I'm willing to pay for them. And because I am contributing a whole lot more in this venture, I have more of the shares, right? Depending on how much he has contributed. So he will own 75% of the shares, and between you and I, because we're poor, we will own the other 25%. And Doc will actually not even go out hunting because he's got other people to do it on his behalf, whom he's going to pay. So you and I will go out there with his employees or his slaves or whatever it is, right? And then we'll hunt, and then the spoils, in distributing the spoils, Doc, while he's sipping on whatever he's sipping on,
it's very nice,
will demand 75% of the spoils. And while you and I will say, but Doc, we spend all our time, in the bush hunting this. It took a lot of our effort. And you will say, well, what ought to be is not what is. And that's, to me, that's where we move away from the politics to the economics.
I totally agree. Following on your good example of how people invest, you should always remember that when the pioneers arrived in Rhodesia, Rhodes was not present, although he was the sponsor
yes.
of the pioneers.
Yes.
And essentially his name has became
synonymous
with Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia. You know, to go back to the issue of land tenure and the problem of the state, people like us essentially don't think the state has the capacity to mediate between land conflicts, because essentially the state is made up of people with vested interests in unjust agrarian structures. So, for example...
So you're saying the state shouldn't even...
No, we're not. Look, the state is the absolute arbiter of land rights. Okay. Because, you see, in a sort of liberal democracy, when you have a system of parliament and governance and so forth, the idea is these people represent people's interests. But, look, we know they don't actually do. When we have an MP who is supposed to represent a constituency, but they are not doing that, they are supposed to, when you have a state that is supposed to represent people, but it's not doing that, we are saying, this is why from a Marxian political economy, is that the state mediates, it plays a role of mediating conflicts among capitalists.
So who owns the land?
Essentially, well, all things being fair, if the state is as impartial as it should be, it's supposed to mediate between different classes that have an interest in land by making sure that land rights are distributed equally across the spectrum. Look, so what happened in Zimbabwe, when the state acquired all land rights, except for a few, to say, look, the land is nationalized, the idea was that the state is going to redistribute those rights equally across the spectrum. Now, I want also to address one myth which says, you need freehold tenure in order. There is no direct link between freehold tenure and agricultural productivity. The history of Rhodesia tells us that essentially agriculture was a hazardous enterprise across the Rhodesian history. This is why when the Rhodesian state, from the early 1930s up to the 1960s, the reason they always promoted distortions in favor of white farmers was that at some moments, the white farmers could not compete with the enterprising black farmers. So you always have those distortions. So what we are saying is the state must be not only an absolute arbiter of land rights, but also make sure that it plays a role of mediating between different groups that want to access land. But knowing as the state as we do, we know that the state is a problematic structure. It will always favor a particular group of people, particularly those who are moneyed, or who have got access to the legal instruments that are acquired and that are needed.
Doc, you've made this even more complex than it should be. Because first of all, land is political. Now you've added another complexity where you said, but the politicians themselves are corrupt.
No, that's not my way. I didn't say they are corrupt.
Well, what you're saying is they've got vested interests.
They are not performing the role they're expected to.
We tend to call
basically, I think what he's saying is that they're human and that it's...
We tend to call
them... So they cannot be flawless arbiters. Exactly. So ideally, on paper, they should. Narnia and in heaven, they are flawless.
You know?
Yeah. But in reality, they're not.
Let's say, look at this.
So isn't that more complex?
All things being fair, Tinashe, all things being fair, when you vest all land rights in the president, let's say the president, everyone hugs and loves the president, is like our neighbor in Zambia, where a good number of people are saying he's a good guy. You vest land rights in him.
Why would you vest?
No.
He's giving an example.
Him, constitutionally, the president represents the state. No, look, he's saying the rights are held on behalf of the people, constitutionally. Right. Now, our idea is that we expect that guy to mediate between different classes that have an interest in accessing land. And that guy, as an arbiter, is a just guy according to the constitution. He must make sure an old lady, a widowed old lady in Binga will access a piece of land. You have a problem when that arbiter, guaranteed by the constitution, start playing a class role where he's favoring certain people against certain people.
Okay.
So that's our problem.
Okay,
now,
fair enough.
We want to give good examples. The issue of Chilonga, for example.
So suppose land is equally distributed amongst all its citizens. By the way, I didn't get any land, but we know some people who got land, but that's not the point. So we equally distribute this land because it's a political constitution. So what happens when one person does better than everyone else?
It's fine square. The state is
well, the natural inclination of that person is to dominate that industry, right? That's what happens in the tech industry. That's what happens everywhere else. So you give me a piece of land, call it 400 hectares. I think that's the sort of number that's thrown out there. So I get my 400 hectares, and I am more productive than everyone else. My maize is 20 tons per hectare, and I've been pumping capital in it. And I'm like, you know what? I think I'm darn good at this. And then I decide that, well, I think it might be a good idea for me to acquire his farm because he hasn't been exactly productive. And your farm, you have not been there at all. You've been having your tipple wherever, and you just not been producing at all. And I come to you and I say, can I please have your land? And I'm willing to buy it. How does that work in your realm?
What we are saying, look, this is a question that even us agrarian scholars are struggling with.
Oh, you struggle with this?
No, not in the way you want to interpret it. I'm saying, look, when the land was nationalized in this country, we have so many people who were offered land by the state. There is a deliberate reason why it's called an offer letter. Is to address some legal ambiguities. It's an offer letter. It means you've been offered, it could be withdrawn.
Disoffered.
Yeah, it could be disoffered. So what we are saying, when you have a large number of people who have been offered land when using the user-fraud concept, you have been offered user rights, not ownership rights. So the state has the right to recover that land. We are saying, since we are generally operating within a capitalist context, it creates problems.
That's not a capitalist context.
So look, you've said something that piqued my curiosity, and I'm sorry, just to take us a little bit back to the politics. So, speaking to what's the reality on the ground in Zimbabwe right now, right? We've had land reform, and people have been given these offers. Right? So, in your mind, from a historical perspective, from a political angle, has the land issue been resolved? Is the land now, notwithstanding Tinashe's preference for the idea that it will always be contested, is the land now held rightfully?
In general, look, over 10 million hectares were transferred from an odd 6,000 white farmers to beneficiaries that spirals into hundreds of thousands. So we are saying, in general, there's been a fair redistribution of land rights to a diverse group of farmers. But land reform is far from finished business for good reasons. In fact, I'm editing. I've just submitted a manuscript, a book on the land issue in the post-Mugabe era now, looking at these issues. We still have former farm workers, women, and people who we call the youth. Remember, the land reform happened 20 years ago. There are people who were pretty kids now, who are now adults in themselves, who want to access land. So we have a problem while we have a much more just land ownership structure. But we also have a good number of Zimbabweans who are yet to gain access to land. And that group must be accommodated. You know why I'm saying accommodated? There is a policy through the Zimbabwe Land Commission. There's a lot of excess land being held by a minority group of farmers who tend to own black and politically connected, who owns multiple farms that are not productive. And as progressive scholars are saying, the government must release that land and allow other Zimbabweans who are productive to gain access to land, because we need equity. And this addresses the productivity issue. We are saying
it will remain contested. That's what you're saying. Because now you're talking about generations.
In any country, land will always be contested, even biblically.
Not exactly. That's why we move from mercantilist. That's why we need to move from a mercantilist or from a feudal system to a capitalist system. So I will buy your argument if we remained in a Marxist system. So in a Marxist system, then equity becomes the objective.
Look, I'm actually quite curious, just an aside, because it's 2021, and I think that the world has run experiments with Marxism that have, as far as I am aware, failed
abysmally.
So how are you simultaneously a scholar, which means that you're intellectual and intelligent, right? And a student of history, I presume. How are you associating yourself with this horrible word, Marxism?
Just to some disclaimers, you seem to be labeling me unjustifiably.
All right.
I never claimed to be a Marxist.
Oh, thank goodness.
I am sympathetic to Marx and political economy.
How is that different from Marxism?
And in fact, even neoclassical, people like Tinashe and all who believes in classical Adam Smith and classical economics, Marx is a prominent person in our thinking of political
Absolutely.
economy. And it's always dangerous to think if someone said they like certain ideas of Marx, they become a Marxist. Now, as open-minded intellectuals, we borrow from some of the...
Where do you start and where do you stop? Where does your... So let me give you a good example where I actually agree with Marx. There's very little you can agree with Marx. I think his understanding with economically was
I think it's
very
lack
abysmal.
of understanding. That's the expression you're looking for.
Yeah. But there's something that I do agree with him. It's on capital accumulation. I think he articulates well how capital is accumulated, which is through industrialization. He's quite clear about that the only way that countries can grow, economic development happens through capital accumulation, and he uses Germany as a perfect example. So I will agree with him there, and it stops there. So I want to know where you start with Marx and where you stop.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that he didn't even finish his book on Das Kapital.
Agrarian justice, access to. Remember, Marx essentialized the idea of agrarian justice and also the process of, because he was seized with the idea of the development of capitalist relations in agriculture and how you transform peasants into wage laborers. Essentially how you industrialize agriculture and create wage laborers who would fight against the capitalist system. So there is some essentialism there, but beyond that, some of his prophecies, to borrow a controversial term, have not come to be in terms of
So you do agree he was more of a prophet than he was a...
No.
I will stop you there. I think that in our last and final segment, when we come back, we will attempt sincerely to exercise our friend of his Marxist leanings, and then perhaps have a discussion about where we are in terms of land and where we should be 10 years from now.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. The wine has been flowing, and we are attempting to exercise our good friend the doc here of some of his Marxist worldviews.
Yeah, we'll attempt.
We'll attempt. So you were basically getting a sense for where he begins and where he ends in terms of his Marxist worldview, and you were articulating that to some extent. Let's pick up from where we left off.
Okay. We're generally saying, look, a good example of how we can have problems, because essentially one of our major issues here is we have the state adjudicating among a diverse group of people who, after the state has acquired all the land rights on behalf of people, of the generality of Zimbabwe, it's constitutional. So we are saying, because of class dynamics of agrarian change, the issue of multiple farm ownership is featured across.
So because based on equity, you would have a problem with multiple.
No, I don't have a serious problem. Everyone will have a serious
problem. No, I don't have a problem with multiple. For me, it's the way multiple farm ownership is happening. Because would you agree if it was meritocratic?
Of course, I would.
So you do accept the acquisition of more farmland based on a merit system or sort. But how is that possible when you don't have title?
Unfortunately,
When you don't have title, I would never.
Look at this. You know, I'm grappling with the idea, and of course we've had this discussion on Zimbabwe television news before with Temba and other guys around. We have people who benefited from land offers from the state, who are going behind the state's back trying to essentially corporatize their land and without merit. Of course, without...
What does that mean, corporatize?
Without complying with the terms of their offer letters. If anyone had the chance to look at particularly the A2 offer letter, the A2 offer letters clearly defines the conditions upon which one is given land, is offered land by the state. And one of the fundamental issues is to pay for the improvements on the farm as a basis of getting a 99-year lease on that farm. You know what? A lot of people have defaulted on that, but have continued to demand the state to extend 99-year leases to them, which I think is a problem. And there comes the issue again around the issue around...
So that we capture for our audience, what you're saying is the only reason, or one of the reasons why the 99-year lease has not happened is the prerequisite is that the farmer must pay for improvements.
And a lot of those farmers are not paying. They continue to want to demand the state to extend those 99-year leases to them without fulfilling their own obligation.
Okay. So why is it that the state has said that they have an obligation as government of Zimbabwe to pay this $3.5 billion? So when the
individual farmers...
Some of the money that is being paid to the former farmers is supposedly coming from those payments for improvements on the farms. And the burden, by the way...
On what basis are you saying this? Because these are critical issues.
The burden is on the individual farmer who acquired an A2 farm to pay to the state the improvements on the farm.
So on what basis? Is this a constitutional? Is this an
I would say constitutional. This is why the state has the right to withdraw that offer from the particular farmer who has not fulfilled. The state has been very political.
Okay, so that we simplify it, are you saying that right now, if you're a Temba Mliswa and you're on a farm, and there's been improvements, and you pay the state for those improvements, he will get his 99-year lease. Or any other individual will be able to get the 99-year lease.
Again, politics is pervasive in this issue. There are people who are going behind closed doors, trying to maneuver to get a 99-year lease without making the necessary payment as per their agreement, as per their contractual obligation to the state.
Do you know anyone who's received the 99-year lease based on this
I wouldn't want
premise?
For legal reasons, I don't want to point to any names.
No, but do you know, you don't have to name them, but do you know individuals?
We now know in general that people who are...
Where's this money going? Where's this money going?
Look at this. There are people who have paid to the state as per their contract.
So if we go to the Ministry of Finance, we will know that there are certain individuals that have actually paid.
Enough, and I can't speak on their behalf. I think that should be public knowledge. Who has paid for their improvements of their farms, and how have they acquired the 99-year lease? But I can tell you, the people who have acquired 99-year leases are in the minority. There's a lot of people agitating that they need to be given 99. We've published a paper on this, and I'm happy to share that paper with you. What we are saying is there are mischievous people who benefited from the land reform, who doesn't want to fulfill one of the major conditionalities to acquire land, which is paying for the improvement. Now, the burden of compensating former farmers is now on the generality of Zimbabweans, including people who do not benefit from the land reform. And we are saying the beneficiary of the land reform must pay for the improvement, so that a fund is created.
When you say we, who's we?
The scholars. Are
you speaking as a scholar? Are you speaking as a scholar with the constituents?
I'm a scholar, that's my profession.
All right.
My profession is to...
So I like the place that we are, because I think we are now speaking to...
Can you articulate that?
Where we are on the ground today. Because I think the question that people who are not interested in politics will ask is to say, okay, fine. We want agriculture to be highly productive. We want the economy to grow. do we have the right framework in terms of current law affecting land tenure and agriculture to deliver the best economic outcomes over the next 5-10 years?
To just follow up on what I was saying, which is, I generally think, look, as a disclaimer, I'm generally against compensation. I think we must not, because I think the colonial farmers owes a huge wage bill to former farm workers who were underpaid for generations, for almost 100 years. And I think these things can cancel themselves out. In the midst of a pandemic, where are we going to get 3.5 billion to pay for people who essentially grabbed land in the beginning? Anyhow, that's a discussion for another point. I'm saying the people who benefited from the land reform must pay as per the offer letter. This is government policy. They must pay. And if there are outstanding amounts that needs to be paid to the former white farmers, I don't agree with the payment anyhow. But if it's going to happen,
the
government must be a bit tight with these people who benefit from the land. They must fulfill their obligations. Otherwise, they must be removed from the land, allow people who can pay for those improvements to acquire that land and contribute to the fund. It's unfair to make someone who never benefited of the land to pay towards that fund. Because the burden now is on the state.
Then that's something that we agree on. So, I would take the argument even further.
So I think in general, going forward, and then I will hand over to Tinashe, is that do we have the right framework going forward for agricultural productivity? We have given people land, and we expect a level of productivity. Our major grievances, which was agrarian injustice, has been reasonably addressed, although there are a lot of Zimbabweans who still want to gain access to land. That needs to be addressed. But in general terms, we now have the land and the burden of production is on us. Now, the state has struggled for good reasons, and some of the reasons you might not agree, although with me, sanctions are a major issue that have undermined our ability to mobilize funding. The state, in any country, the state must support agriculture. The state, whether you agree or not, does not have the capacity currently to support the farmers, to kickstart productivity. Land tenure issues. If you are an A2 farmer who lack secure tenure, the banks have been pretty iffish about 99 years.
No, they're not iffish. They won't lend you money, period.
It's not be absolute. They can be persuaded if the state So we're saying our 99 lists have not been perfect. The World Bank have tried to work with the Zimbabwean government towards this issue, and I've written around it saying, how do we strengthen the 99-year list in order to allow these farmers to...
So let me ask you a question, because I think, in fact, let me give Tinashe an opportunity to strong-arm the opposite argument, which is my view as well. I believe that title deeds are better than 99-year leases. And I think I'll allow Tinashe to articulate why title deeds are better. And maybe if you disagree, you can perhaps give your perspective. Tinashe.
So the real reason why title deeds are better is not actually for bank borrowings and loans. Actually, that's the list of our worries. Is so that in the true entrepreneurial venture, and if we call farmers entrepreneurs, which I think Marx would have a problem with, if I start defining farmers as entrepreneurs, which in the 21st century we must, is that land use changes. So when Marx was writing, he could not conceive land use actually changing. But when you see the 21st century, the idea of land use actually changing is becoming real, right? So what I mean is I could take my piece of land and I could turn it into a tourism venture. And then from tourism, I could turn it into a real estate venture. From real estate, I could turn it into a factory or whatever it is I deem fit. So there's a lot of entrepreneurial energy being spent. And for that entrepreneurial energy to be spent, one must have title. Because when one has title, the effect of land change is that it goes through generations. So it's not just the immediate generation, but probably the generation that would enjoy it will be third or fourth. And I'm going to experiment quite a lot with the land that I have. Now, our problem with our agrarian reform or the land tenure system as this is it has been very dogmatic and very strict on what
land use is and on what production is, which is farming. But if you look at the 21st century, we're actually moving away from farming. And I think that once people have title, you will find that they will actually put more of their capital into changes of land use, that's number one, but also into productivity of the actual land if it's farming. Because you must keep in mind, because we are not Malthus here, right? You know Malthus, the idea that as population increases, we just do not, we have finite land and we don't have enough land to feed the population increase. What's going to happen naturally is we'll have fewer and fewer farmers. Because if capital is actually let out in farming, what will tend to happen is the thousands of farmers will somewhat reduce, using also the Pareto rule, 80-20, that of the 80% of the farm, 20% of the farmers produce 80% of the produce. So naturally, those farmers will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, especially in a capitalist system, and you want them to. But you also then have people who are more entrepreneurial, who will decide that maybe we're not good at farming, but we have this piece of land which we have paid for, and we can change the use of that piece of land. And that actually increases productivity of the country. So the problem I have with the current system is that first we've made it a political issue, and then we've been very straitjacketed about the use of land. So what then tends to happen, and this is where politics happens, is what tends to happen is you then need to go to the local government or whoever it is to change land use, to make it more urban, and then you then have these landlords, land barons, and all sorts of things. It shouldn't be that way. What we need are title deeds, and I totally agree with you that these people, if they want title deeds, they must pay for it. So according to your system, where I think we could maybe agree, is we should have a three-tier system. The guy who does not have money and is dogmatic about not paying for anything, then that guy should remain with an offer letter.
Why should that guy have any land? The next...
Because it's political, for whatever reason. This guy is on the land and he does not believe in anything, then you must remain with an offer letter. Then we have the second where you will agree, which is the 99-year lease, that this is a guy who will pay for the improvements at whatever the state deems is the necessary amount that must be paid, and they can get their 99-year lease. But I think that there should be a third avenue for title deeds, for a guy who says, you know what, I know this land now belongs to the state, and I'm happy and willing to pay the state for the land. And if I can pay the state for the land, then whatever I do with that land, it's now up to me. So if the land lies fallow, the state has no recourse. And the reason why my land is laying fallow is because I'm in an entrepreneurial journey of changing the land use, or whatever it is. I'm experimenting and whatever. Would you agree with those three tiers?
Look, I'm sympathetic to some of your analysis, but at the same time, I need to correct one thing. The state has not been very dogmatic with land use. For example, people are allowed to venture into partnerships. People are allowed to grow whatever they grow, be it horticulture, be it...
With an offer letter.
With an offer letter. And let's also address this myth around freehold. When you have freehold rights, it means you're going to be productive. There's no direct link between freehold title and agricultural productivity. There are studies that have been done across countries. Right now, let me tell you one thing. We have over 100-something thousand tobacco farmers, smallholder tobacco farmers, who are now the major producers of the crop. You know what? Those people are in what you call insecure tenures, but they are now the backbone of the tobacco production. They don't have any title. Now, that addresses the myth that to produce you need secure tenure. And I'm not necessarily against secure tenure, but I'm saying, as scholars have spent time trying to understand, it's not true to say if we extended freehold tenure to even people in communal areas, we're going to go in an upward trajectory in agricultural production. It's not true. We have farmers, even in Rhodesian times, who needed state intervention to be productive on their farms, even though they held freehold tenure. So there's a lot of factors that influences agricultural production beyond land tenure security. And look, if the government came up with a spectrum of land user rights, including freehold tenure, it's fine.
Would you have a problem with it?
I won't have a problem, because already people, you see, there is an issue around de jure land rights, which are enshrined in law, and de facto land rights, which is what you actually do on the land, whether you have title or not. So what I'm saying is, for example, there's a lot of people being very productive on land where they don't have so-called secure tenure, are very productive. If you go in tobacco producing provinces, much west, much central, there's a lot of economic activity around land that is not held in freehold title.
You know, there's a lot of synthetic capital that has actually helped tobacco. And by that I mean the funders of
but
tobacco.
How are they funding when those people?
Because the funders of tobacco have taken that risk. Now, taking that risk will not always exist.
Yeah, but
so you must accept.
You agree with me that capital can come even where they are perceptions.
No, absolutely, but it will always be limited. If you look at productivity of our tobacco farmers, it's actually very low. And the reason why it's that way is because it's limited. The funding that's actually going into tobacco.
I think we have material for a hangover episode. So at this particular point, I would like to thank you for watching. Have a great weekend. COVID is real. Stay safe. And to quote my good friend George, who I hope gets well soon, be good. And if you can't be good at it.